Welcome to Ufahamu Africa, a podcast about life and politics on the African continent. I'm Kimmy Dion, one of your hosts, and I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Rachel Beatty-Riedel. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Kim. I'm so glad to be here with you, my lovely friend, for episode 199.
I can't believe it.
It's a testament to you. It's,
And you, oh my gosh, this podcast would have died without
my
you.
gosh, it's just so fun to do this together. And we keep learning every week, and hopefully sharing some interesting insights with our listeners.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. This week, I'm sure to learn a lot because we are featuring a conversation that Kim just had with Carolyn Holmes, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And she is the author of the book, The Black and White Rainbow: Reconciliation, Opposition, and Nation Building in Democratic South Africa, which was published by University of Michigan Press in 2020. Now, Carolyn is an expert on South African politics, so she and Kim talk about next week's elections and everything that has been happening in this really fascinating run-up to those elections.
Yes, on May 29th, South Africans will vote in the seventh election since the end of political apartheid in the early 1990s. Now, this is the first election in which the ruling party, the African National Congress, the ANC, is polling below 50%. And that could force the ANC into a coalition with one or more parties in order to govern the country after the election. And so in our conversation, we talk about the ANC, we talk about Jacob Zuma and like the whole, court saga and fiasco of his role in these elections and what it means, like thinking about this generationally. But we also talk about some upstart political parties and civil society activists, such as those in what she calls the fallist movements, right? So talking about like roads must fall, fees must fall. I really appreciated hearing Carolyn's analysis about young people in South Africa and beyond, who are politically engaged, but we may not talk about them that way, right? Because they don't necessarily vote or they don't register to vote, but that doesn't mean that they're not politically engaged. It's telling us something about how they're experiencing democracy and like how we should think about what elections are doing to serve democracy. And for our listeners who haven't read Carolyn's book, it has one of the best introductions I've ever read in a book by a political scientist because it captures and illustrates her argument so beautifully about how difficult it is to both build a nation and build a democracy at the same time. So here at Ufahamu Africa, we actually read aloud Laura C's review of her book, and we'll link that review in the episode show notes. So folks who may not have checked out Carolyn's book yet can have a listen. But we also just encourage you, in this time that these really big elections are happening, her book is a good read for that.
It's such an important moment for us to think about what South Africa means as an example. When we look across the world and we see so many places where we have exclusive versions of nationalism on offer, versions of nationalism that are meant to restrict to a certain part of the population. And that was South Africa's history. And so to be able to make this transition to an inclusive version of building a nation, a rainbow nation, and having vibrant, transparent, accountable governance from democracy that results from that, that meets the needs of the whole public. I mean, it's a huge order. It's a tall order. It's the order of democracy in our modern era. And so we have so much to learn from South Africa, both in terms of the history and up till now, and then as we see it go forward in this next election.
I agree, Rachel. And we talked, it's so funny because we talked about load shedding. Because this is a thing that came up a lot in, I can't remember if it was last season or the season before. We had non-resident fellows who were living in South Africa, and it was very difficult for them to, have the resources that they needed. And yet we can see that there hasn't been load shedding problems in the months leading up to the election, right? So it's, it makes me think about young people, you know, saying no to elections and saying yes to protests. Cause it's like, look, we're not gonna stand for you giving us electricity in the months just before the election. We want electricity all the time. Right. So there's something, I don't know, there's something I'm really learning from that conversation with her and thinking about not just what are really going to be pivotal elections in South Africa, but also, like, again, this is why I love having this podcast with you and having these conversations with you, is because it's making me think about like, what does democracy actually mean? What is good governance, right? Like, what does it mean to actually provide services to people? What does it mean for people to have voice, to feel represented, right? To feel heard. And I think, this conversation I had with Carolyn was just like a really good reminder that people are taking these hard questions and really thinking about them in specific cases and trying to use what we learned from those specific cases to think more deeply about democracy.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that ties in with a number of different conversations that we're going to be previewing in the week ahead around the number of military coups that have happened across the kind of Sahel, Western Africa in particular, and what that means. It's not that, there isn't that demand for democracy and accountable governance. It's a demand to get there, pathways to get to that accountable delivering governance. And so that also connects to the news that we have coming out of Democratic Republic of Congo this week, which is a kind of an ongoing pockets, regions of insecurity that make it difficult for citizens to be able to enjoy both rights and liberties and democratic order, to be sure. So both by non-state actors, rebel groups, and by the ruling government. So this week there was an attempted coup in DRC. With the authorities followed that attempt with an arrest of more than 50 people, including 3 Americans and a British citizen, which it's really a kind of fantastical story. So Kim, can you give us a little more detail on this?
Yeah. So I have to admit, I hadn't heard about this. Right now I'm teaching African politics, and I start every class with the question, Habari Gani? And in Swahili, that means what's the news, right? And not everyone has news about like what's happening on but I want them to try to connect what we're learning in African politics to what's actually happening in African politics in real time. And so I can't even remember, like, I talked about a few different news articles about the El Nino drought in Southern Africa, about um, William Ruto is visiting, President Biden for an official state visit, blah, 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 like boring ass stuff that your African politics professor comes up with. And one of my students, Jocelyn De Hoyos, is like, oh, yeah, there was like an American involved in a coup in DRC. And I was just like, okay, that's cute. Like, I don't believe that. Like, I don't know where you got that. Like, I was like, I was such a jerk. I was kind of like, okay, Jocelyn, okay, whatever. Like, moving on, kids. Like, let's, um, which was like, again, like, this is me. So disrespectful, right? Then, of course, like before I go back to teach on Thursday, I'm like, I'm gonna just look this up, whatever, Jocelyn had talked about. And like, it's real. I thought this student was confused, but no, it's just because this story is just a little bit nuts that I just couldn't believe it. So the Associated Press has a report on one of the Americans who was alleged to have been part of this failed coup attempt, right? One of these people who's detained. His name is Tyler Thompson, and his family, based in the US, said he was in Africa on vacation, right? So telling, of course, that the family refers to it as Africa and not DRC, right? He was in Africa on vacation with family friends and had not previously engaged in political activism. So according to the AP report, Thompson was among at least 2 other Americans who were named by the Congolese army as part of this failed effort to overthrow the government in Kinshasa in the early hours Sunday morning under, quote, an eccentric self-exiled leader, Christian Malonga. Um, Now, Malonga's son was born in Utah. His name is Marcel Malonga. He's 21 years old. He was also arrested by Congolese forces. And apparently, Tyler Thompson had played high school football with Marcel Malonga in the Salt Lake City suburb of West Jordan. and he had traveled to Congo with his former teammate. Now, I just want to react as well. So, like, okay, cute joke. Kim's student comes in and says this thing. Kim doesn't believe it, but then like finds out and like, oh my gosh, how nuts is this? Like a young American involved in a coup, and his family referring to his vacation as being in Africa, right? Like big place. He didn't coup Africa. He was like specifically in one country. But the other thing is, if you look at the AP report, and I'm grateful for the Associated Press reporting on this because it's how I learned a lot about like, you know, the dynamics and the connections, like these like transnational connections. But also, if you look at the photo of Tyler Thompson, it's a family provided one. So it's of him smiling. It looks like it could be a Facebook or an Instagram profile picture, right? It doesn't, quote, look like someone who was part of a coup attempt. And I think that just like, you know, and even like my own kind of fascination with this is like because there was an American involved, right? And I just think that, you know, it's all fun and games, except someone tried to launch a coup against a purportedly democratically elected government. And the chutzpah to think you could or should do that. And then the kind of flippant way, maybe it's not fair to say it's flippant by the AP, but the fact that they just had this Facebook profile picture of Tyler Thompson instead of like treating seriously like, yes, he's a white guy from suburban Salt Lake City, but he also attempted a coup, and maybe we shouldn't have a smiling picture of him um, as the thing that we're seeing when we're because
Mhm.
this is serious, and I think for many Congolese people who for decades have lived under insecurity, like I think we maybe we should treat this a little bit more seriously.
It's such an important point, Kim, and the extent to which this piles onto, like, when you have a coup attempt, um, the layer of insecurity that creates, not only at the political elite level, but through different institutions and regions of the country, right? Like there are real ramifications. And so I just want to kind of layer on to, another story that's coming out of DRC this week, which is an ongoing note about the sitting president Felix Tshisekedi, his goal of kind of pushing out the UN peacekeeping mission, MONUSCO, by the end of 2024. So, this is we've been hearing, and this has been happening across the Sahel region as well, with the U.S. Military base being evacuated, U.S. leaving Niger, with the French leaving Mali, right? And now we see, again, in a place where we've had coup attempts and successful coups, all three of these countries, pushing out external military supposed allies and peacekeepers, in part because the government focuses a narrative on these external peacekeepers as a problem, as creating problems, and so, in some ways deflecting from their own inability to provide security and order. So it's an interesting kind of parallel that I think when we look at this coup attempt in DRC and the way it's woven into an ongoing security crisis across the DRC, right? So this article that came out this week by Africa Center for Strategic Studies, Paul Nantulaya, really goes into some good detail. We'll link to it in the show notes about the degree to which average citizens are dreading the withdrawal of UN peacekeepers. They, in general, believe that the government forces are completely unable to provide security in Eastern DRC. And when the peacekeepers recently left bases in South Kivu, those posts in that province have been plundered by the Congolese troops, taking out, the reserves that had been left behind. More than half of the policemen assigned to occupy those bases that once housed Pakistani peacekeepers have been deserted by the Congolese police. And those police that remain, have low morale. They're not getting paid. They're reportedly getting food from the nearby Protestant church, which again, those kinds of resources of public provisions of food are meant to go to citizens, right? And so now it's one more kind of layering on of the security concerns. So the UN's withdrawal really seems at odds with the security realities, where attacks by the rebel forces in the region are expanding. They're continuing to increase. Over 7 million Congolese citizens are displaced, and more than 80% of those internally displaced citizens live in areas that are currently protected by this peacekeeping mission, right? They've been displaced to go to the areas that are under UN peacekeeper control. So this really is raising the concerns about citizen safety. And the focus that the president and his coterie are placing on the MONUSCO peacekeeping forces, in many ways distracting attention from the inability of the Congolese security forces to protect their own citizens. I will note that the MONUSCO mission also delivers, in addition to, peacekeeping, it is delivering certain services in the region like demining, community-based early warning systems. It has a program on building judicial capacity, community conflict resolution, and building up collaborative civilian-led, citizen-led mechanisms for protection. These are things that the government has failed, the current government has failed to do, prior governments have failed to do for decades. So the local communities themselves really perceive the military, the police, and the intelligence services of the state as part of the problem. They fear and distrust those coercive arms of the state. And the regional actors who benefit from the insecurity, in particular, illicit miners who benefit from the instability, have been further contributing to the deterioration in the region. So the Congolese government says that the peacekeeping mission hasn't been aggressive enough in battling the M23 rebel group. They haven't been successful in battling them, and that's the reason for their discontent against the mission. But as we know, peacekeeping missions are very circumscribed in terms of their ability to use aggressive force. They are only mandated to use protective force. And so their mandate isn't, it's a complicated, peacekeeping is a very complicated space. And so there are these sets of ongoing tensions around MONUSCO's operations that have led to some violent clashes between MONUSCO itself and the state forces, and some deaths there. So, it's really an important reminder that the military itself can be seen as preying on the security of its own citizens, and yet the rebel groups that are also preying on those community groups are facing a lot of impunity. So a really critical moment for DRC in general as they continue to grapple with the ongoing security concerns. And again, these kind of broader parallels to what we're seeing in particular places where the balance between a government's ability to provide order and citizens' ability to get the governance that they demand is lately. This is not sufficiently functional to broadcast power to be able to provide a foundation for democratic governance.
Really basic functions of the state, right? Yeah, and it's reminding me, of course, of like Severina Tesser's books, right? Which I think anyone who wants to have a better understanding of, like, and maybe a critical look at MONUSCO and peacekeeping, the peacekeeping mission in Eastern DRC, I think that it's a great place to start. One last bit of news I do want to share with our listeners this week is a a year-long joint investigation by the Washington Post, Lighthouse Reports, and a consortium of international media outlets that was published earlier this week. Their report shows how the European Union and individual European nations are supporting and financing aggressive operations by governments in North Africa to detain tens of thousands of migrants each year and then dump them in remote areas, often barren deserts without food, water, safety. Now, um, I, I'm not sure how much of what is learned through this investigation is new, right? If we think about a lot of work that's been done by scholars and also investigative journalist Sally Hayden in her book, My Fourth Time We Drowned, I think that this is more confirmatory evidence. But I still think it's important for our listeners to check out. We'll have a GIF link to the Washington Post investigation in our show notes, because what I think is really compelling and powerful about this report that is different from Sally Hayden's really important book is there's video evidence. You can see it with your own eyes, right? They're looking specifically at like vehicle registration numbers, right? These are vehicles that were purchased with EU funds that are carting people out into the middle of a desert, right? So it's like this on the ground detailed evidence with video. So, it's and that these things have been known and discussed in internal reports in Europe since at least 2019, right? I think, as we talk about, some of the insecurity that migrants face, just trying to seek a better life, and how the inhumane treatment that they receive. Um, I'm not saying we shouldn't point the finger at, security forces and leadership in North African countries, but, that finger should keep pointing north towards Europe, who is funding it and making it all possible and are doing it to externalize their borders, um, for a whole host of reasons, not least of which, again, to bring it back to the beginning of the show, democracy, right? Like one of the challenges of electoral democracy is that every few years you've got to cater to the people in your country, and maybe you're going to engage in some xenophobic rhetoric, right? Some anti-immigrant rhetoric. And one way to do that is, if you're a quote liberal or progressive party, so that you don't get nailed on these issues about, these xenophobic attitudes within the public and xenophobic rhetoric by your competitors, is like make the migration problem go away. And the way to do that is to offshore this, your borders even further offshore. And I'm, just as we ourselves here in the United States are about to have an election, I'm really concerned about what this means for how we just think about other humans and their right to exist and to to have full and healthy lives. And I just want us all to be mindful that the shared humanity that we have, so that we're I don't know, these technical reports are helpful in some ways, and maybe to make the case even more clear about what it is that we're doing, and what we're complicit with.
Exactly, Kim. So well said. And as we think about those questions and the way in which we're so interlinked, I think we'll draw a lot of lessons about that from your conversation today with Carolyn Holmes. So take a listen.
So thank you, Dr. Carolyn Holmes, for joining us on this week's episode of Ufahamu Africa to talk about the upcoming South African elections.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted to start with, especially for our listeners who haven't been following the lead up to these elections, which are scheduled for May 29th. may not have a good sense of what's at stake, why this election is significant, why so many people internationally are paying attention to this election. So could you just start with giving us like a 30,000-foot view of these upcoming elections? What are things we should know or should be paying attention to?
Sure. So the elections in 2024 are marking, depending on when you count the demise of apartheid, 30 to 33 years since the end of white minority rule and the introduction of multiracial democracy. And that 30 years has been eventful in the world. It's been eventful in South Africa. It's meant demographic changes, economic changes, social and cultural changes. And so what we're seeing in 2024 is a very different electorate, a very different set of issues than the first democratic elections 30 years ago. So in terms of the big issues, right now, South Africa is plagued with extremely high unemployment. And that's been the case for the last 30 years, but it has grown remarkably, especially in younger demographics in the last 10 years. So by some estimates, youth unemployment is near 50%. Overall unemployment is about 33%. If we look at the Afrobarometer data, it's somewhere around 25%, right? Because it depends on how you count unemployment versus underemployment. But all of those are sort of unacceptably high. And that's correlated with enormous economic inequality that's not only persisted since the end of apartheid, but grown. And this is mostly in the sense that the upper deciles are zooming away from the lower deciles of income. And while we do see increased racial integration in the wealthiest South Africans, the vast majority of South Africans are being left behind by the economic growth that has happened. And partially this is because of all sorts of factors involving international trade of the currency, the declining production of minerals, and obviously unemployment. So all of these things mean that South Africa today economically is quite different than it was 30 years ago. In addition, there are infrastructure issues, especially the much talked about load shedding crisis that has been going on over the course of the past few years in South Africa, where essentially, although infrastructure for things like water and electricity has been built out, the sort of backup capacities have not been sufficiently expanded. So while there are, say, improved water sources for the vast majority of the population, the infrastructure, the core infrastructure itself is sort of crumbling. While more South Africans today have electricity than ever have as a percentage of the population, the capacity for generation of power hasn't grown with the infrastructure. And so there's a capacity issue in terms of governmental service delivery that is a real problem for a lot of South Africans. The other thing that's getting a fair amount of oxygen in the lead up to the election is violent crime, which remains remarkably high in South Africa and seems to be experiencing an increase since 2020. And while the world in general saw an increase in violent crime in the context of the pandemic because of a variety of different things involving lockdown, economic frustrations, et cetera, South Africa's not seen the same decline in post-pandemic crime rates as elsewhere in the world. And so a lot of South Africans are really concerned about crime as a central issue in these elections, especially because the police are nationalized in South Africa. So it is a central government issue. It is not a local government issue to the same extent as it would be in a place like the United States. So people are looking to the president, looking to the parliament to address these kinds of issues. In terms of the players, we obviously have the ANC. ANC has been the ruling party in relatively non-competitive elections for the past 30 years. And this election, a lot of people, based on both data in terms of polling as well as sort of vibes, as the youth might say, are indicating that like this new set of voters, these people that are post-apartheid coming into their political adulthood, are just not that sold on the ANC as liberator, equating to the ANC as ruling party. So the the honeymoon period, I guess, is kind of over in the eyes, if it ever existed, in the eyes of a lot of young voters. But they are still obviously the largest party by membership. They're the largest party by seats in parliament, by local governments, et cetera, leadership of local governments, which are elected in different years. But they've seen a precipitous decline in the last 10 years in terms of their support.
Right.
We also
So
have,
can I just jump in
yeah,
there? So this is
absolutely.
so the ANC, right? This is the African National Congress, who had, like, this is the party of Mandela, right? This is, they
Mhm.
have this long history of, right, you know, ending political apartheid, right? They were a driving force, in exile, and then in ruling ever since 1994. But we have seen that their vote share has declined over time, right?
Absolutely.
Especially in the most recent elections.
Hmm. Yeah, so their local vote share has always trailed their national vote share. They've never been able to capture local governments to the same extent that they've captured the national government. But it is important to note that since 2004, they've seen a real fall off in terms of their support and also in their ability to turn out voters. So we've seen both the incidence of voting as a share of registered voters go down enormously, especially in the last two elections, as well as the ANC's vote share going down over that same time period.
So I want to ask, just since we're talking about the ANC, um, I've been curious about the former president, Jacob Zuma.
Mhm.
Now, he's I would call him an old head. Like, he's been around for a long time. Obviously, he served as president.
Mhm.
But his presidency was marked by, these massive corruption allegations and investigations, um, and yet it feels like he's
And
and convictions.
convictions,
Yes, exactly.
right? It's not just allegations, it was convictions as
Right.
well.
And yet he remains kind of you know, he's still a player, it seems. I mean, he's not running,
Mhm.
or is he? I'm not sure. Like, every day it's like a new thing. Like, so he's certainly not running for president.
Mm.
He's not going to be the next president. He's not even going to try to be. But there were all of these things about him running for a parliamentary seat, which is a bit odd.
Mhm.
No, but like also like,
Yes.
um, you know, the fact that he wants to run, that he's been fighting to run because there are these, obstacles. Can you say a little bit more about,
Mhm.
you know, that? Like, what is going on with Jacob Zuma, and why does it even
Sure.
matter that he's run? Like, does it even matter that he's running? And
Mhm.
what does this whole saga around the former president mean for how we should think about the ANC and its connection to voters?
Sure. So the ANC has always been a huge tent, right? I mean, they're trying to hold together a really broad coalition, and we can see that in the successive generations of ANC leadership. Obviously, we have Nelson Mandela, who famously spent 27 years in prison. After that, we have Thabo Mbeki, who spent the most of the struggle against apartheid in exile. After Thabo Mbeki, with a little bit of with a few interim presidents in between, we have Jacob Zuma, who is the first of the South African presidents to have been involved in the armed struggle, right? So he bills himself as like a man of the people. He tends to speak in Zulu at his rallies. He likes singing. He likes dancing. He's sort of a good time guy, according to everyone that I've ever known that has spoken to him. And he's incredibly charismatic, right? And he very famously said while he was president that the ANC would rule until Jesus came again, right? And then he faces some legal trouble involving the quote unquote improvements to his home, and is forced to pay back an enormous fine. And then in 2021, right, he's found to be in contempt of court, and as an ex-president is put in jail. Um, and this is a really pivotal moment, right? Because he is going to be sentenced to 12 months of prison time, which does disqualify him from ever holding elected office at the national level, according to the South African Constitution. So He is then released on medical release, compassionate release, because he says that he is far too sick to be in prison. He needs the attention of a doctor on a regular basis. He's released on medical for medical grounds and as a compassionate release. And what happens is he sort of goes quiet for a bit, and then suddenly he emerges in the context of this election as the leader of a new party, which confusingly is called Umkhonto we Sizwe, which is the name of the former armed wing of the African National Congress. So he builds him, and Umkhonto we Sizwe is the organization, the armed organization in which he served as a fighter for the ANC. Now he's part of this Umkhonto we Sizwe party, and he is both running for office until very recently and very much not. He says, I'm the head of the party. I'm not a candidate. I'm just here to support because we truly are taking on the liberation mantle. We are the true potential liberators of South Africa. And why is he so popular? I mean, this is a question that a lot of people ask. And it's partially because he's got a sort of personal touch, I feel like, that a lot of ANC leadership simply does not have. So we have the sort of technocratic Thabo Mbeki from just post-Mandela. We have Cyril Ramaphosa, who is very much a business person, and I wouldn't call him a technocrat necessarily, but he is very much at home in a suit and very much at home speaking to sort of the leaders of the business community, et cetera. And Jacob Zuma presents a really different version of political leadership to the one that has sort of taken control in the ANC.
And so there's this new party, right, that Jacob Zuma forms. What are there other new parties? I know that one thing about these elections that are different and new is that now independent candidates can run, so you don't even have to be party affiliated to run. And I'm sure a lot of people could make the case for why that's good. It's because it's like, opening access to, people who may not have partisan connections. But just, as someone who studies a different country in Southern Africa, right? And in Malawi, I actually worry that independent candidates is bad for democracy. It actually leads to more power with the president, because what happens is people will run as independents if, for example, they lose their party primary or just because they can. And when they run as an independent, then they do the math after the election is over, and they align with the, party that has the most seats, or with whoever won the presidency, they'll align with that party so that they can potentially get, distribution or spoils from office. And so I don't know, this thing with independent candidates being able to run in South Africa, I don't know the extent to which you're concerned about that, or maybe it's too early to tell. I'm not sure. So what can you say about new parties and independent candidates?
Sure. So I'll talk about the independent candidates first, because this was quite the change, in fact, in South African electoral politics. And the independent candidates that have actually been able to make it to the ballot are people that have strong followings and high profiles already. So are people like Zaki Ahmad of the Treatment Action Campaign, and they are running. And I feel like the movement to introduce independent candidates in South Africa was a movement to try and get people interested in democracy again, because of the tremendous fall off in terms of voter enthusiasm, in terms of voter turnout over the course of the last 10 years. There's a real urgency to how do we address ANC dominance without mandating very undemocratic things. So this intervention is an interesting one. And I think that people expected more independent candidates than actually ended up making it to the ballot. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. But I do think that there is this sort of open door for really populist politics that comes in with independent candidates, because they are people that command a power base of their own. Right? They don't have a field office. They don't have a get out the vote operation. They're just there. And I think that we know the sort of dangers of populism in general for democracy. I don't know. I don't know, I guess, is this the short answer. We'll see. We'll see what happens. In terms of the new parties, there's just a lot of them. So the fascinating thing is that everyone thinks of like the young upstarts in opposition being people like the economic freedom fighters and Julius Malema, right? The firebrand former leader of the ANC Youth League, who ends up founding his own party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, and they like really spectacle-based politics, right? They like to storm out of parliament and they like to have big demonstrations and they have a uniform that they wear in
I was
parliament.
going to say they're in all red. They've got red berets. And like, I think of EFF as a new party, but I guess now they're not that new anymore.
Well, and the longest serving opposition party leader in parliament is Julius Malema. He's the old guy now, right? That's fascinating. It's fascinating because he has built his reputation on being sort of, fighting from the battlements. And that's not really the role of the EFF anymore. Now we have a huge host of parties all over the political spectrum. So we have former leaders of established parties like the Democratic Alliance, former leader Mmusi Maimane, who now has the Build One South Africa campaign, which is a pretty centrist, it's a little hard to tell what they stand for other than, just sort of building one South Africa, which sounds very nice, right? Like it sounds like a very nice slogan.
It sounds like a nice slogan, but it also sounds like they haven't read your book.
The thing is that where does the idea of one South Africa come from? Like someone has to say it, and someone has to say it convincingly. And whether Mmusi Maimane, again, former leader of the DA, is the person to say that, I don't know, right? That's not for me to decide. But I think that there is the interesting thing in this election is because of how many new entrants there are to the political scene, what we're ending up with is an electoral map where and this is a map both sort of in terms of age, in terms of geography, in terms of all sorts of demographics, where people have more choices than they have in a very long time. And the alliances between these different parties have shifted radically. So the Democratic Alliance, which has been an opposition party since 1994, well, just after 1994 when they became the Democratic Alliance rather than a Democratic Party, doesn't really matter. I'm sure that it matters to people in the party. I shouldn't have said that, but I'm deeply apologetic to anyone who is part of the Democratic Party and enormously offended by that. But right, they've served in opposition, and the fascinating thing in this moment where the ANC seems poised to potentially lose their majority is that a lot of these smaller parties are running as potential ANC coalition partners rather than just on their own steam, because the traditional parties of the opposition, like the DA, have said we absolutely will not be part of the coalition. They have said we are not going to sign on with the ANC. We are opposed to the way the ANC has run things, and so we are a party of opposition.
Okay, so okay, forgive me, I clearly do not know enough about South African politics. So if this is a super naive question, has the ANC ever formed a pre-electoral coalition in the past?
No, so never at the national level, right? There's always been the tripartite alliance where we have COSATU, the ANC, and the Communist Party of South Africa, right? And so they were emerging into democracy, right? The tripartite alliance was the only game in town, but that was because the ANC was the senior partner in that.
They were so dominant, like why would they need to?
Exactly.
But this time they know they don't have, right? So this is one of the things, like all of the polls are saying that the ANC is polling at about 40%, I think, give or take, depending on the poll, depending on the day.
The interesting thing is that in the last 2 weeks or so, the polls that I've been seeing have shown, in fact, that vote share seems to be climbing as opposition parties like the MK, the Umkhonto we Sizwe Jacob Zuma party, which he's not actually running in, right? Who knows who's even running in that party at this moment? But they have had a sort of enormous blow up in the last 2 weeks. Legal battles over who's going to be the head of the party. The actual guy who is supposed to be heading it gets kicked out. by intra-party mechanisms, and then Jacob Zuma is disallowed from running by the Constitutional Court because of his criminal conviction of contempt of court. So who's running that right now? Well, maybe his daughter, but then his daughter shows up at a rally and is unable to speak in Zulu to the people, and so she uses a translator, and then people get really upset about that. So the explosion of MK in the last 2 weeks has led people to be a little bit more wary of them. Also because they don't have a lot of sort of tried and tested leadership in their ranks. They have a lot of new and young leaders, which is not a bad thing, but I think that, it, in combination with the perceived volatility of the party, has led people to be like, wait, hold on one second. I'm not sure you really have your house in order. So, in the last 2 weeks, ANC polling has gone up. And I don't know what to make of that, right? Because ultimately the only poll that matters is election day.
Facts. Yeah. It's interesting though that in the run-up to the election, they weren't as they didn't appear, the earlier polls suggested that they might not have a majority. And I think that's one reason why a lot of people have been paying close attention to this election, because everyone was saying this could be the first election where the ANC doesn't have a majority and they'll have to form a coalition. Right. And so I'm guessing that means, leaders in the party were like, okay, well, if that's going to happen, let's find some friends and say, right, that we'll be in partnership after the election, all things going well.
Right. The ANC had played their cards pretty close to their chest in terms of the potential for coalition partners, because I think that there's a lot of people in their ranks that are still hoping for the best in terms of their electoral fortunes. There are other parties that have explicitly said we will not be in coalition. And in fact, South African experience with coalition government at the municipal level has been really interesting and very varied. So we had, for example, the Democratic Alliance, which is a sort of center-right party, historically predominantly white, and controlling the Eastern or the Western Cape for the longest time. But they got into coalition with the far-left economic freedom fighters to be in charge of one of the largest municipalities, and it was just enormously dysfunctional, right? For the entire time that this coalition held, it was fractured. It was not very particularly productive. There was a lot of fighting. There was a lot of sort of back and forth within the coalition, allegations of mismanagement. And so I think that in some ways, the sort of signal of coalition government for a lot of South Africans signals dysfunction. And that's partially because it's not been the order of the day for the entirety of South African multiracial democracy. But it will be interesting to see the menu of potential coalition partners on the basis of turnout. But it's just because the electoral landscape is so enormously different than the last national election. We don't really know how a party like Build One South Africa or Rise Mzansi or MK is going to do. And the 2019 elections were also pretty noisy in terms of where voter enthusiasm was going. So we see in 2019 parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters surging, but the other big winners out of that were the Inkatha Freedom Party and the Vryheidsfront, the Freedom Front Plus. So historically Afrikaner, very conservative party. So those were parties that everyone thought were in the political wilderness, and suddenly they double their vote share in 2019. So I don't know. I guess is what we can say about what coalition politics might look like. We do know, however, that the ANC has made a real push electorally, in terms of policy in the last couple of months to try and prove that they still have what it takes to sort of get things done. So we have the National Health Insurance Bill, we have the Bela Bill, which basically has compulsory school attendance to try and shore up the ANC's credibility in terms of delivering on things that people have said that they want.
I've also heard there's been less load shedding in these months leading up to the election than there. I mean, if we you can just go back to Ufahamu Africa episodes. I don't remember if it was last season or the season before. We actually had a non-resident fellow. We had two non-resident fellows who were living in South Africa at the time. And I just remember the struggles they had with actually
Mhm.
putting episodes together just because of load shedding.
Yeah.
And then there was like this whole, we had a couple of episodes on, how do people creatively navigate,
Yeah.
this inability to access literal power, right?
Yeah.
Like not
Hmm.
having electricity and managing through that
Yeah.
is really, but I
Absolutely.
haven't been hearing those complaints the last couple of months, which is very
No.
smart for an incumbent government, right? It's like things might be bad, but let's make sure that power is online ahead of the election so that
Hmm.
can't be a thing people complain about.
And there are a lot of questions about how it is that this is happening, right? Because South Africa is going into winter, and right, winter is a time of enormous demand on power infrastructure. And yeah, I don't really know what the answer to that is, honestly. And there have been lots of jokey predictions among the pundit class that like the power is going to go out in South Africa for 2 weeks after the election, just to like make up for all of
Last
this.
time,
And
right? It's like we
exactly,
overused.
we
Yeah.
over.
Uh,
But I mean, I'm not an electrical engineer, but I don't actually think that that's how electricity works.
Yeah, I don't think so either. But it is curious, if they can manage to make power available like
Hmm.
this as they have been these last few months. And what have they been doing for the last 5 years? Like why, what is it? And and I wonder how long South African voters' memories are, right?
Yeah.
So like some of it is, um, are, to what extent is the voter going to have what we political scientists call recency bias when they get into the
Yep.
polling booth, and how that's going to determine who they vote for. But, there's a theme that's coming up in a lot of your responses to my questions today, and that's kind of this centering of the experience of the young voter.
Mhm.
And, I think about, there's this there's this term that people use in South Africa called the born free. So right, this is
Mhm.
referring to the born free generation, the people who were born after the end of political apartheid, and people born after 1994. Like, what does this mean? Like, who is the ANC to us? And I guess I don't really want to ask you like who is the ANC to them, but I just
Mhm.
wonder about these younger voters, right?
Sure.
Who are they? Are they really apathetic? Like how would you compare them to, what we think about young voters elsewhere in the world? I guess, you know, maybe the 2019 election can tell us something
Mhm.
about younger voters, but maybe not, because that was 5 years ago, right? So like
That's the
many
problem.
people have become enfranchised, right? Have
Hmm.
become 18 years old since that election. And I'm just curious, like, what should we think about young voters in South Africa? Are they going to turn out? Who's trying to reach out to them and court their votes or get them registered into the polls?
Yeah. I mean, the fascinating thing is that of the potential voters, right? So we're not talking about registered voters, but the potential voters in South Africa, 42% of them are between 18 and 39, right? So in terms of what the South African potential electorate looks like, it is dominated by people who have grown up under ANC rule. And I think that that matters. That matters a lot for the ANC, in part because their ability to sort of draft on the liberation credibility is not as strong among younger voters. And that's been borne out by any number of surveys, right? It's very much, what have you done for me lately? And that's young voters everywhere, right? That's young voters everywhere. That's not just South Africans. And young voters, young potential voters, young South Africans, I should say, are far less likely to be registered to vote than older cohorts of people. So the older, it's basically entirely correlated with age, right? The older you are, the more likely you are to be a voter in South Africa, or at least registered to vote. So while we have voter registration of up to 80% of voters in their 50s through 70s, younger people